anybody hasn't heard Rabbi Tatz before, this is your opportunity, and go to his website afterwards if you enjoy it, www.akivatatz.com. And I was trying to work out with Rabbi Tatz. I know some of my students are also going through some of his courses. So Rabbi Tatz maybe can just explain if anybody wants to do a paid course on the Nefesh HaChaim or Derech Hashem, Rabbi Tatz can explain how to do that. So without further ado, the show is yours, Rabbi Tatz. The platform's yours. I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just have a wave? I know people are hearing me. Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Rabbi Hill, for this opportunity to study. Secondly, I'd like to welcome my sister. This is Anna Louise Shapiro. I see her on my screen, so it's a great honor to, when your own family listens to you, you have credibility. If your family doesn't listen to you, people say, well, they're the ones who really know him, and they don't think much of him. So it means a lot to have your own family support you. Yes, you mentioned the Jewish workshops. I'll mention that briefly just because you mentioned it. So Jewish Workshops is a great group in Jerusalem that run live subscription events, webinars. I'm one of the speakers on their panel, but what I do for them is on Thursdays at 8 p.m. UK time, we are learning through Nefesh HaChaim. So you sign up for that. It's a paid subscription, and then it's a very personal live webinar that's been going for some years actually. And on Sundays, we're running mini-series on Derech Hashem. And I think if you sign up, then you get all the back recordings so you can catch up to where you are now. So again, there's lots of stuff for free. You don't have to pay for that, but those who want that, subscribe. And I must say I'm indebted to Jewish Workshops for doing a very good job on that. Second point is I'm seeing mostly black boxes and a few faces. Let me just point out to you, it's much easier to speak to people than black boxes. And I see at least one person is logging in from the London Underground, which is quite, I see her on the London Tube. And if you're brave enough to do that, in public, then yeah, that's much appreciated. So if you show your face, it makes it easier for me to talk and know that people aren't, comatose or falling asleep at everything I say. Yes, I know some of you insist on having your eyelashes glued on and, having painted your nails black with pink glow in the dark glitter, but I haven't done that today, so tolerate you're not doing it either. So I appeal to you just to make it easier to, this Zoom thing is not easy anyway, speaking at a distance, sitting in front of your screen. So if you see people and you see them responding, it makes it easy. In fact, Rabbi Hill, I'm going to ask you, if we do this again, to maybe ask your students to, that little bit of live reaction makes it a lot easier to teach. Okay, let's talk about this very difficult subject of emunah, which we create. Lulu, I know your face, so it's nice of you to show it, but thank you. I appreciate it, but don't feel obliged. Thank you. Anyway, okay, so the subject of emunah, this is the 3 weeks that are the difficult time in the Jewish calendar. And of course, our thoughts turn to the difficulties and the darkness around us. This is where we really feel the exile. And of course, the absolutely central focus of emunah is being able to penetrate the darkness, to know that there's a meaning and a reality, even though you don't see it. It's closing that gap, which is really the work of emunah. And I think we feel that most strongly at difficult times, at least the need for that. So let's work out the subject as deeply as we can. And I'm going to do my best to leave time for some questions. You can put them in the chat box a bit later. If I don't understand what you're saying, you can unmute yourself, and I'm very happy to answer your questions if I can. The story begins like this. When we talk about emunah, we translate that concept as faith or belief. That's a look in the King James Bible. You want to see the English translation. So when the Torah uses the word emunah, the conventional English translation is faith or belief. And here's the problem. And this is the question I'm going to try to focus on throughout this whole discussion. The problem is that the definition of emunah in English, when you talk about faith or belief, you are talking about something you cannot know. That is absolutely essential to understand. Faith is something that is blind. We call it blind faith. In English, we talk about a leap of faith. And essentially, we're talking about something that you cannot know. If you know a thing, you call it knowledge, you don't call it faith. When you cannot know something, then you call it belief. So essentially, the central core of the concept, the English word of faith and belief, is something that's unknown. And if that's correct, it leads us to two very serious questions. One is, can you know that God exists? Let's be brutal. Let's go to the core issue. Can you know that Hashem exists, that God exists in the world? And of course, there are many things that flow from that: the veracity of the Torah, the reality of being part of the Jewish people, all the things the Torah teaches us, the meaning of all the mitzvahs. Obviously, all those things are follow-ons. But let's be honest, the most basic concept is we don't see God, and we want to know, can you be sure that he exists and that the spiritual world is real? Who's right? The atheists who say that the whole universe is some cosmic accident, or the religious thinkers who tell you that it's created by an absolute creator? That is the central question. Now, here comes the problem. If you can know that God exists, if there's some way to get knowledge, why do you call it belief? Belief is something you cannot know. And if you cannot know it, if you cannot know that God exists, then indeed belief is an accurate word. But then the question is, why should I do it? Why should I commit myself to a relationship with a God I cannot see and I cannot ever know? And maybe have to die one day for that. Talking about very serious obligations in Judaism. Why should I be loyal to a religion that commit myself to a relationship with a God that I can never be sure actually exists? So let's get this question absolutely clear, because the horns of this dilemma will form the framework for this whole discussion, and really should form the framework for your thinking about most of life. And that is, do we know that God exists? Do we not? If we know it, then why do we call it belief, which means something blind and something that cannot be known? And if we don't know it, never mind belief, why should I do it? Why should I? And not only that, how do you know that Judaism is right? Maybe some voodoo Haitian cult is right? There's, all those questions become real questions. So I'll say it one more time. The basic question is, can you know that Hashem exists? Can you not know? If you can know it, why call it faith? Faith means the unknown. And if you cannot know it, why on earth should I commit myself to something that is eternally and permanently a vague sort of a commitment to something that is not factually established? That's my question. Are we together on that? You see the logic of that question? Okay. The Jewish answer to that is very clear. You can know that God exists, and you need to know it. The Rambam classes the mitzvah, he calls it leda, lahamin, veleda, to believe and to know. He classifies knowledge as part of the mitzvah. You need to know that God exists. Okay, if that's true, there are two obvious questions. Number one, how do you know it? How do you get the knowledge? I'd love to have that knowledge and get it secure and clear. And secondly, if I can get the knowledge, why are you talking to me about faith? Get the knowledge. Okay, those are going to be the two questions that I'd like to try to work through them. What I'm really aiming to do is chart a direction. Obviously, we'll not be able to go into depth in all of the points, but at least map out a direction for your further thought and study. Let's deal with the first question. Sorry, swallowed a small frog. The first question is, can you know that God exists? And the answer is yes. Now the question becomes, how do you get that knowledge? So let's approach that. I don't intend to deal with this fully, but at least point a way forward for you to research on your own. And the answer to that question is, first of all, you need to know that when we talk about knowledge, we do not mean absolute knowledge. I can't emphasize this point strongly enough. When we say that in Judaism, you should know that Hashem exists and the knowledge is available, we don't mean absolute knowledge. And the reason for that is not because this thing is vague and doubtful, but because the human mind is not capable of absolute knowledge. Say that again. The human mind, no matter how brilliant and no matter what evidence you have, you can never know something absolutely. There's always the problem of your consciousness and subjectivity of your consciousness, and you can never know anything absolutely for sure. I'll prove this to you by giving you a simple example, a very simple example, and that is, and this is a very embarrassing, humiliatingly simple example, you cannot even know that you're awake. You can't know you're awake. Maybe you're dreaming, right? Let me ask you a question. Please raise your hand if you're awake right now. Okay, Larry, that took you more than a couple of seconds. So, that's but okay. Okay, raise your hand. You're absolutely sure that you're awake right now. No, you're making a mistake. Maybe you're dreaming that you're awake and you're listening to a fantastic share on Rabbi Hill's, program, and you're dreaming. Look, when you're asleep and dreaming, you think you're awake, don't you? That's why you can go through ecstasy or agony in a dream. If you knew you were dreaming, you wouldn't be suffering. It'd be a free horror movie, it'd be fine. Why do you go through such abject terror in a dream? It's because you think you're awake. So if you think you're awake in a dream, how do you know you're awake now? Now, look, my friends, if this troubles you seriously, you need to see a doctor, But the point is that theoretically, you cannot know. Absolutely. Let's say you'll say you pinch yourself. Well, you could dream you're pinching yourself, couldn't you? Listen, you cannot even know you're awake, okay? And yet, when you wake up from a dream and you perceive that you're awake, you know it, you're awake. Or maybe you were dreaming in a dream and now you woke up from that and you're still dreaming. Now look, you cannot even know that you're awake. In practice, of course, it's not a relevant problem because when you know it, you know it. But you never know a thing absolutely with 100% proof, and that can never be clinched. By the way, I'll permit myself just an aside, if I may. Why does God cause us to dream? Why does he cause us to dream? Why would he put us through the cruel exercise of living in a world that our Torah teaches is illusory, right? We are taught that the world's an illusion. It's a false world. And one day when you leave this world, you will enter a dimension that is genuinely real. Now, if that's true, why would God put us into a world that's unreal? And in the unreality, give us a dream which is even more unreal. And how cruel is that? You go through a dream and you go through some terrifying experience, and then suddenly you wake up and you sit up in bed and you say, Baruch Hashem, that was only a dream. Like you were living in one reality and it turned out to be nothing. And now you enter, why would God do that? Why would he put us in a dream world? And then in the dream world, our world, put us into a dream which is even more unreal? And the answer is amazing, amazing, amazing answer. The answer is, if you didn't have that experience, you'd never be able to know that life here is not the ultimate life. Yes, I think Larry's put his finger on it beautifully. I would put it like this. Imagine your friend walks up to you and they say to you, this whole world you're living in, our religion teaches us it's an illusion. One day you're going to die and you're going to leave this world and you'll find yourself in a real dimension. You'd say to your friend, do me a favor. That's a fanciful story. Multiple dimensions. Do me a favor. I deal with what I can experience. You're telling me this is half real, is another reality. All what you see is what you get, and that's all I'm prepared to relate to. God says, you know what? Go to sleep. I'll show you. What happens? You go to sleep, and in your dream, you're going through some incredibly real experience, some terrifying experience, and then suddenly you wake up and you say, Baruch Hashem, that was only a dream. Can you be sure? Once you've ever been through a reality and had it fail, and then show you that what you thought was real was not, you can never again deny that the life you're living through now might not one day give way to another reality. The most important teaching about reality is the unreality of a dream. Because it would be very unfair of God to expect you to relate to another dimension when this one ends if you didn't have an experience of it. And therefore you feel it in your flesh. You live in a dream which is so graphically real, so real, engages your emotions, engages everything. An instant you wake up and you realize nothing. And that's a preparation for leaving this world and entering another. And God doesn't play unfair. He gives you a tangible experience of that. Anyway, that's not our direct subject. But the point I'd like you to take home at this point of the discussion is that you cannot know anything for sure. And therefore, when we talk about establishing God's existence, and we say you ought to know it, we don't mean 100% knowledge. We mean good enough evidence. And the reason is, again, not because the evidence for God is weak, but because you need evidence for everything in your life, and you can never know anything for sure. When you make a decision, and even a critical decision, a medical decision, a surgical decision, you're going to trust the surgeon, you're going to fly on a plane, you're going to do something that your life depends on, you will never, ever have access to 100%. Never have access. You'll have 90%, 85%, 95%. In every field, you need a certain level of compelling evidence. When the evidence is good enough, you act. When you made a decision to marry, right? You took your time finding a suitable marriage victim. Eventually, you found one. You made a decision to get married. Did you know for 100%? No. It was always balance of probabilities. And doctors work that way, and pilots work that way, and the world works in that fashion. my friends, you will never have 100% evidence. If you're intellectually honest, when you have enough evidence, you act. What's good enough evidence? I don't know, 85, 90, 95%, whatever it is. But anyone who says to me, Rabbi, I want 95% evidence in the rest of my life, but in religion, I want 100, I cannot deliver the goods. That person is being intellectually dishonest, or they're misinformed, or they are avoiding the issue. The honest position is, I accept 85% in the rest of my life. If you can show me 85% evidence when it comes to religion, I'll make a commitment. That's the honest and logical position. And therefore, do not set yourself up for failure. Don't go into religion looking for 100% evidence because it's unrealistic. It's not a standard you demand in the rest of your life, and you're guaranteed to fail. Incidentally, and I say this, I'm sure Rabbi Hill will enjoy this, if you're involved in Jewish teaching and what we call Jewish outreach, it's a very serious mistake when people advertise proof. Come to my lessons, my lectures, my seminar, I'll prove to you that God exists. The problem is you never prove it. And people walk away feeling worse than they think this is the best evidence and it's not good enough. When you run an outreach seminar for a weekend and you tell people come to our outreach seminar, and you'll walk away, on Sunday night knowing that God exists, you're doing them a terrible disservice because you will not give them 100% proof. And they'll walk away thinking that the best evidence we have is not good enough. And therefore, we should not be advertising proof. We should be advertising compelling evidence. If you say to a person, I won't give you proof, I'll give you very compelling evidence. I'll give you evidence at least as good as equivalent areas of your life. And that's all I can offer. But it's good enough for you in the rest of your life. It ought to be good enough for you here. So I hope this point is clear. And that is why there will always be a gap. There'll always be a gap. And I venture to suggest to you that when it comes to religion, the gap will be bigger than in some other areas. And I say this on good authority. The Ramban, no less an authority than the great Ramban, says when it comes to Torah, there are no proofs. Amazing. He says this about his own commentary. He says, don't force yourself through the eye of a needle, to try to prove things, because there's no 100% proof in Torah. And he says that when it comes to religion, the levels of establishing proof are not as good as they are in engineering or mathematics or physics. And I think you can understand what he means. In mathematics, they're formal proofs. When it comes to religion, it's a different type of an area. It connects with emotion and other aspects of consciousness. And therefore, I'm not advertising absolute proof. Okay, that's point number one. Now, how do you get the knowledge, even if it's not absolute? Rabbi, give me 95%, evidence. That's good. How do we do that? Okay, this is a very long discussion, and there's a wonderful literature on it, and a wonderful Torah literature. But I'll sum it up in a very formal way, just by giving you two general categories. And again, I'm warning you, this is not a full discussion, but it's enough for you to start researching the subject yourself. And when we talk about knowledge of God's existence, we're talking about two pillars on which that knowledge rests. One is scientific philosophical investigation. You look at the world around you and you ask yourself, is this really a random accident that needs no explanation? And there's a whole line of thinking, both in Jewish sources and non-Jewish sources, that follow that line of thinking. The most famous by far is known as the argument from design. That's by far the most famous. I'll give you the simplest phrasing of that. Once a non-Jew asked Rabbi Akiva, you're going back 1800 years, he said, Rabbi, I think the whole world's an accident, right? The whole world's an accident. So Rabbi Akiva at the time was working on an incredibly beautiful manuscript, or he had on his desk in front of him a very intricate and beautiful manuscript. So this person looked over and he said, Rabbi, that's beautiful. He said, who wrote that? Rabbi Akiva said, well, no, actually there was a piece of parchment here and the inkwell just happened to spill and the ink spilled, and it just happened to, as the ink spilled, it just happened to form this incredible document with all its beautiful poetry and so on. And he said, Rabbi, do me a favor, who are you trying to fool? That's impossible. He said, really? And you think the whole universe came about by some accident of molecules bumping into each other, and that's how we got the planets and the laws of chemistry and physics and mathematics? That's the argument from design. Is it 100% proof? No, but it's very, very thought-provoking. So that's one line of thinking. And I'll point out to you just one fact about this line of thinking, which I think is very, very beautiful to understand. And I heard this from my great teacher, Simcha Wasserman. He said that these types of proofs, scientific, logical proofs, the argument from design, and many, many others, these are always proofs by exclusion. In mathematics, there are two types of proof. There's proof by derivation and proof by exclusion. Derivation means you take a first principle, you get it established, you make a more complex theorem on top of that, and eventually you get to the part that you want to prove. You derive it from first principles. The other is, you can't derive it, but you know A or B must be true, okay? Either A or B. I cannot prove A, but I can disprove B. If you can disprove B, you've proved A, but it's a very different type of proof. And the reason it's different is this. When you prove a thing by derivation, you end up understanding it because you started with the first principle that you could experience and you built it step by step. So you end up understanding what you've proved. Proof by exclusion leaves you with a proof with no understanding. A or B must be true. I cannot prove B, but I can disprove A. That leaves you convinced that the opposite is true, but absolutely no relationship with it. And all proofs of God's existence and the Torah are always like that. You cannot prove the universe and God's existence by first principles, but you can show that the alternative is very difficult to support. That the world has no explanation, that it needs no explanation. Even the biggest atheists and the biggest evolutionary atheists tell you that complicated things need explanations. They say, well, we've got an explanation. It's called evolution. Really? Does evolution explain the sun and the moon and the planets? What's the explanation for that? You know, Richard Dawkins was once asked that question. He said like this, he said, complicated things with very, very high specification need explanations. And that's why the biological world is so incredibly complex, it needs an explanation. And we have one, evolution. So someone asked him, Rabbi, what explains mathematics and physics and the chemistry of the, you know, the physics of the moon? And he said, no, that's not complex. Yeah, that's not complicated. That doesn't need explanation. Really? Chemistry and nuclear physics, that kind of stuff doesn't need explanation? I mean, what have you been smoking? Anyway, the point is that that's one line of thinking. And it's valid. And in Torah sources, there are plenty of sources that analyze that way of thinking. There's another one, which is more important. And that is known as the proof from Sinai. That we met God. We met him personally, not you and me, but our great-great-grandparents, who are totally reliable, and handed down the story through the generations. And that we usually put as the major pillar of our knowledge. And that's specifically Jewish, by the way. The first one is general philosophical. This one is unique part of the Torah story. Now, in order to understand that proof, we need to know two things. First of all, what exactly is this claim of Sinai? What is supposed to have happened there? Why is it so convincing? But more important for many people is, I wasn't there personally. You want me to accept a story wending its way through the mists of time? We all know that stories told from one person to another get distorted. If you want to have a lot of fun with your friends, get a few friends in a room, get one to whisper something in the ear of another individual, get that person to whisper the story to somebody else. By the time you get to the end of the room, it will have nothing to do with the original story, nothing. So we know that when you tell a story over through many iterations, it's going to be no resemblance at the end. And we're relying on this telling of a story that went through thousands of years. I mean, what chance is that it could be correct? Let's address those 2 points. And again, I'm only pointing a direction, right? We can't possibly go into all of this in detail, but I'll point a direction and give you some references. First of all, Sinai, you should know, is an absolutely unique claim. I'll just mention one of the facts that needs to be studied here, and that is the revelation at Sinai is the only, listen carefully to this, the only time in the history of humankind that anyone has ever claimed a divine revelation to more than one person alone. That is beyond astounding. Let me say that again. Only once in the history of the world has anyone ever claimed that God spoke to them face. I'm not talking about miracles. I'm not talking about prophecy. I'm talking about a direct meeting with God, face to face, that you heard God speak. No one has ever claimed that except us, right? For example, Christianity. Christianity begins with Paul's famous vision on the Damascus Road. Paul was a Jew, Saul of Tarsus, lived a couple hundred years after JC. He came and he said God appeared to him. And the Jews said to him, who was with you during that revelation? He said, well, it was my own private revelation. The Jews said, no, that's not good enough for us because we had millions of people hear our revelation. Muhammad came out of his tent and he said God spoke to him. Allah spoke to him. And the Jews said, and who was with you at the time? No, it was personal. God spoke to me in a dream. We said, not good enough for us. Now, my friends, we know someone's lying, okay? Because Christians and Muslims, they call them infidels and they call them dogs. They've had crusades against each other, okay, because of their warring beliefs. We know that in the world around us, there's definitely a liar. And even the liars have never claimed Even the liars have never claimed that God spoke to them with more than one witness. Look, if you're lying, you might as well make up a better story. What about Samuel? Samuel heard a voice of prophecy. I'm not talking about Nevuah. I'm talking about God speaking to somebody face to face, that had a revelation of God, and that happened at Sinai. And the question is, why has no one ever claimed? It's an absolutely unique claim. Anyway, that needs to be established, and there are good books on that. Probably the best book to read in English is Rabbi David Gottlieb's book on that. There's a whole book working it out. And the original source that he's using is the Kuzari. As you probably know, the Kuzari was written going back 800 years, and it's the definitive classic in Jewish literature on the Sinai claim and this claim of the story being told throughout the generations. Let's speak just for a brief moment about how we can trust the story. Okay, Sinai's incredible claim, but again, like I said, you can say anything you want if you're going to Julia. Hashem spoke to every prophet either in a dream, in a more or less wakeful state. But I'm not talking about a prophecy in which the prophet receives a message in a metaphor, an analogy, and then he has to interpret it. I'm talking about standing face to face in front of God. No one's ever claimed that except us as a public revelation. Okay, that's an astounding fact. But more important is the story. So any story wending its way through the mists of time and who knows how many generations, there's no way it's going to be accurate. If you read the anti-Semitic literature on this, they always put it like this. They say, there was probably an Abrahamic family, wandering in the desert, probably eating magic mushrooms and having visions, and they came up with a story. And every generation, the story was embellished. And it's been embellished endlessly. And today we call it the Torah. That's the Torah. My friends, that is a totally incompetent claim. And as a Jew, you need to know why it's incompetent. And I'll tell you why it's an incompetent claim. Again, listen well. Endless number of generations. And in every generation, people telling over the story and embellishing it, okay? And more embellishments until we have a document today called the Torah. That is an incompetent claim, and I'll tell you why. How many generations have there been between Sinai and us? Let's take a round number and call it 3,200 years. Let's use that number. It's actually over 3,300, but let's take a round number, 3,200. Let's call a generation 40 years. 40 years, enough time for parents to tell their children, even grandparents to tell their grandchildren, which is a Torah mitzvah. How many times does 40 divide into 3,200? I'm sure you're all mathematical geniuses, and the answer is flashed onto your screen instantly, and that is 80. Only 80. Only 80 generations. Yes, it's 3,200 years, but only 80 natural generations separate us from Sinai. That's enough. The Rambam actually lists every one of them. The Rambam 800 years ago lists the Torah leader of every generation. We know exactly who they were. We have their original writings. We're not talking about some vague story through thousands. We're talking about a very limited, specific, finite, multi-corroborated story. And we have the records of every generation. And when I say we have the records, I don't only mean we have an unbroken chain of transmission. We have the writings. And for over 2,000 of those years, we have the original parchment. If you, for example, go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay? The Dead Sea Scrolls are 2,100 years old. And there's a fragment at least of every book of the Torah there. I mean, all 24 books of the Torah, except for Megillus Esther. Except for Esther, there's at least a part of every book of the Torah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're the same as we have now. Unbelievable. You know that my friend Rabbi Mordechai Becher told me he took his kids there. He said his 10-year-old climbed up on a box. He looked into the glass case at a 2,100-year-old scroll of Isaiah. And he started reading. He said, Abba, we learned this 10 days ago in school. Rabbi Becher said the real miracle is that the kid remembers what he learned 10 days ago in school. But anyway, you have a child in the modern era reading a scroll of Isaiah, the parchment of which is more than 2,000 years old, and it's the same words we have today. What do you mean embellished over time? And not only that, for more than 2,000 years, you know how many centuries the Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities have been separated? Completely separated, copying their own Sefer Torah through hundreds and hundreds of iterations of copying. And you know the difference between our two Sefer Torah is one letter. If you look in an Ashkenazi Sefer Torah, the word Daka is spelled with an Aleph, and in a Sephardi, it's spelled with a Hey, which doesn't change the meaning or the pronunciation or anything. My friends, that's not bad for 3,340 years. One letter, right? After centuries of separation, you're talking about. And you know why? Because a Sefer Torah is to be copied meticulously from another Sefer Torah, and we are fanatical about that. Anyone who's ever been in any synagogue, Orthodox synagogue on a Shabbat morning, if the reader makes a mistake, basically they stone him, like they stone him. I mean, it's like, we are fanatical about that transmission. And therefore, I'll give you another example. Here's another example. I live in England now. So in Cambridge, they have a thing called the Cambridge Geniza. The Geniza is an astounding thing, absolutely astounding. Nowadays, of course, you can access it online. But the Geniza, fascinating story, I'll just mention it briefly. In 1897, a repository of documents was found in a shul in Cairo, in Fostat, which is a suburb of Cairo, where actually the Rambam himself lived. In the women's section at the top of the shul, there's a hole in the wall. And in 1897, I wish I had time to go into the full story, but I'll just tell you an outline. They found documents had been for 2,000 years. The community had been keeping documents in that room. They never threw away documents then. Either they were Torah writings or they were valuable. The parchment was valuable. In fact, in those days, you used parchment at least twice. When someone wrote you a letter, you wrote a letter back on the back of the parchment or between the lines of their letter, right? Because you didn't throw that away. So for various reasons, documents were kept in that room. How many documents? 300,000. How they were found is an unbelievable story. I wish I had time to tell you the story. If you'd like to read about it, I recommend 2 books. Do I have a copy to show you? Do I have a copy to show you? I don't know where my copy is now, but this, by the way, is Rabbi Gottlieb's book, which goes through the Kuzari story. Very highly recommended. So I'm sure Rabbi Hill can give you that name if you need it. But the story about the Cairo Geniza, the 2 books I recommend. One is a very good journalistic investigation of how it was discovered and what it means, and that's called Sacred Trash. Because don't forget, it's a Geniza. It's where they threw things away. So the book's called Sacred Trash. And a lady professor from Florida last year came out with a book, an incredibly detailed history. What's that called? I think it's called Geniza Fragments. And if you email me, I'll happy to. I have a copy somewhere. I just don't see where I put it. But she, a fantastic work on the detailed history. Now, what they found in the Cairo Geniza, eventually the pieces were shipped to England. And in Cambridge today, there's 185,000 of the documents that were shipped from Egypt to Cambridge, and I've seen them. Okay, you get special permission. I've been in there. My friends, I held in my own hands a piece of a Sefer Torah written in the year 600. That's before Islam became a religion. Okay, so you're talking about documents there. They're still collating them today. They're still collating them. Maybe Rabbi Hill will invite me, or maybe Rabbi Hirsch. I went in there with Rabbi Hirsch and we took photographs. They let me actually take pictures of about 40 documents, hundreds of ksubas of women getting married in Cairo in the 10th century, 11th century. There's one ksuba there that says, "My dear wife," the husband writes to his wife, "I marry you on your conditions. What are your conditions? I employ no servants without your permission. I will go on no business trips without your permission. I will invite no friends home that you don't like." I mean, this is written in the ksuba. Not only that, listen to this. She was a Karaite woman. The Karaites only took the Torah literally, no oral law. So he said, "I give you permission to sit in darkness on Shabbat," because they never lit any lights on Shabbat, "but you have to give me permission to sit in the light part of the house." Like, unbelievable. When the Rambam arrived in Cairo, he put a stop to that, and there were no more documents like that written. There's a hechsher on cheese given to a cheesemaker in Cairo by 11 of the rabbis of the time. By the way, he was also Karaite, and so they made him swear on a Sefer Torah because it's the only thing that they accepted. There's business letters of the Arizal. There's the handwritten signature of Rav Moshe Cordovero. I mean, from the Ashkenazi world, the Sephardi world, there are, by the way, this is quite moving, the only document in color is a siddur of a child from the year 1100. And on the first page of that siddur, the child, you can see his handwriting. He's written Aleph, 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 Bet, 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 and then he sketched a little picture of himself on his camel. You can hold that in your hands. Okay, it's like there's mezuzahs there from, by the way, the mezuzahs until the Rambam's date are decorated with Magen Davids and little, you put a stop to that. Absolutely not. You're not allowed to do that. Amazing, amazing documents that are on the card. Read the history of, but the main point is 185,000 Torah documents, and they corroborate exactly what we have today. corroborate exactly. In fact, unknown sources, the book of Ben Sira, for example, which is not part of the Torah, it's an apocryphal work, but the book of Ben Sira was found in its entirety there. There are, apart from Torah stuff, there are hundreds of Spanish poems. You know, the great Ibn Gvirol and Yehuda Levi, they wrote the most sublime Hebrew and Spanish poetry, love poems. By the way, there are one or two love poems there written by two of their wives, which are better than the husband's poetry. And if you're interested, they recently published a book of just the poems, right? It's called The Dream of the Poem, English rendition of hundreds of Spanish and Hebrew poems written by the great rabbis of the 12th and 13th centuries. Anyway, we could speak for hours about this. But the point is, all I'm trying to point out to you is when people claim that this is a vague story wending its way through untold generations, no, it's 80 generations overlapping with corroboration with the same documents and the same text of the Torah throughout all those years. Let's turn our attention to the second part of our discussion. Part one, we claim that God exists. Absolutely. How do you know it? There's evidence. Study the Sinai experience, the transmission, look at the scientific evidence, and you'll come to a conclusion. But now the question becomes, well, why call it faith? Why do you call it faith? That blind belief. Here comes the clue, and here comes the key. The key is that the translation of faith is not the right translation. If you're a Christian, meaning if you live in the Western world today, faith means something blind. Absolutely. Listen carefully, please. When we use words in English, they come loaded with a culture. When we use words like faith, the words are loaded with the culture that we live in. And so in the culture around us today, the word faith means something that you cannot know. Absolutely. In England, where I live now, it's considered impolite to argue about religion. What right do you have to insult somebody else's religion? Religion is a personal feeling. It's a warm, fuzzy feeling, and you decide on it yourself. Evidence? That's irrelevant. You know, the best proof of this, you'll see that many times a very popular subject for debate is between atheists and religion. In other words, the science-religion debate. Watch carefully and you'll notice that the participants in those debates are almost always incredibly highly qualified scientifically and almost always have no formal religious knowledge. Why? Because in their world, religion is a personal feeling. You don't need to be qualified. Time magazine a couple of years ago ran a debate between Richard Dawkins, a violently atheistic scientist, professor of evolution, and Francis Collins, a very highly qualified, I think is a Nobel Prize winner, geneticist who happens to be religious. Both of these men are incredibly qualified scientifically. No one has any religious training at all. Dawkins wrote a book about religion that the philosophers say is less than childish. How do you do that? The answer is, in their world, science you need to be trained in. Religion is personal feeling. That's ridiculous in Judaism. I can't say it better than this. A few years ago, they arranged a debate in Jerusalem on the subject. And one of the speakers was a world-famous astrophysicist, very atheistic, unfortunately Jewish, whose great-grandfather wrote a famous Talmudic dictionary. But this man is an atheist. So he got up to speak first. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know much about religion. First of all, can you imagine you've been invited to Jerusalem to debate this subject at the highest international level? Your first statement is you actually don't know anything about the subject. Amazing. But you don't need to know about it. So if it's a personal feeling. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know much about religion, but I think it can be summed up as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's what he thought, and that's what he spoke about. The next speaker was Rabbi Refson. Rabbi Refson is an English rabbi with a very dry British sense of humor. So he got up and he said, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know much about astrophysics, but I think it can be summed up as twinkle, twinkle, little star. You know, you're going to talk about a subject, you ought to know about it. In the world around us today, religion is something you don't need to know because it's a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's got nothing to do with logic. I'll tell you a story. A few years ago, I was traveling from London to Johannesburg, and it was a long overnight flight. And I found myself sitting next to a man who told me that he's Episcopalian charismatic preacher. Don't ask me exactly what it is, but it's Christian. He spent the whole night trying to convert me to Christianity. Incessantly. It was a long night, I can tell you. Around 2 a.m, he starts explaining to me that the founder of Christianity from Bethlehem is qualified to be the Messiah because his father, Joseph, the carpenter in Bethlehem, was descended from King David. You know, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all make a point of tracing his genealogy to Joseph, the father of JC, through the house of David from Yehuda. Because we know the Mashiach has to be Ben David. So it's very important for Christians to establish that he comes from the right lineage. And therefore, Joseph, the carpenter in Bethlehem, the father of JC, is in fact descended from the house of David. So I said to this preacher, but look, you're a Christian. According to you, surely Joseph was not involved in his birth. Mary conceived immaculately, right? Joseph was not involved. And therefore, what's relevant, his lineage? Problem? He looked at me with consternation and he said to me, what does logic have to do with religion? In other words, he wasn't being facetious. In his book, you don't have to be logical. We're talking about spirituality, about your own feelings. In Judaism, that is ridiculous. Anybody who studies Talmud knows that it begins with logic. And therefore, that's not our translation. When we say faith, we do not mean blind faith, because that's not how to translate the word emunah. So here's the right translation. Emunah does not mean faith. It means faithfulness. Ne'eman in Hebrew means to be loyal. We're not talking about blind belief. Blind belief is worthless. You might as well believe anything if it's blind. We're talking about evidence, very strong evidence for the Jewish story. Now the question is, will you be loyal to the evidence? We're not talking about blind belief. Will you stay with it when it's 95% proven or 90% proven? And there's that little bit of a gap, but the evidence is excellent and it's better the alternative and you have other motivations. Will you be loyal? Let me try and prove this to you. I'd like to prove it and then explain it if I can a little bit. What's my proof that the word emunah in Torah does not mean blind faith? It means loyalty. I'll give you a few examples. During the war against Amalek, the Jewish people are battling, and Moshe Rabbeinu Moses is standing on top of the mountain and he's holding his hands up. As long as he holds his hands up, we win the war. Listen to what the Torah says. V'hayu yadav emunah ad bahashemesh. His hands were emunah till the sun went down. His hands were faith? No, his hands were faithful. That's the only way to translate it, right? The text is telling you what the word means. Another example, Abraham is speaking to God. And during the conversation, the Torah says, Vehemin Bashem. So the King James Bible translates it as, and he believed in God. Abraham believed in God. A prophet doesn't believe in God. He's speaking to him. It doesn't mean he believed. It means he was loyal to this God, even when asked to kill his own child. The word emunah does not mean blind faith. It means faithfulness. It means attachment, even when the scene gets dark, even when you can no longer see clearly. Yes, at this point, I don't see it, but I know I'm based on logic. I had a clear vision. Okay, now I've got to walk through the darkness. True. I'm not claiming that everything is light and bright, but the evidence has to be there. The knowledge has to be there. Yes, there are tests in the times of darkness. Absolutely true. Yes, but it begins with a knowledge. It doesn't begin with a leap off the cliff because you think that's a good idea. That's ridiculous. Yes, there's a leap off the cliff, and that's not easy, but you only leap off the cliff because God himself told you. You made it up yourself. You can come up with anything. Now you may say to me, just 1 second. 1 second. If the evidence is good enough, what's the problem with emunah? Excuse me. If you give me 95% evidence and I admit that it's good enough, but of course you're going to be loyal. What idiot is going to see the truth in one direction and be disloyal to the truth? And the answer, my friends, is you. Because we are built in such a way that we can see the truth in one direction and we can ignore it. Totally. We can stare the truth in the face and walk in the opposite direction. In Greek philosophy, they call this akrasia. They call it the gap between the head and the heart. To take it from the head and put it down into the heart and the organs of action is not simple. It's not simple. You can know a thing as clear as it gets and act in disloyalty to your knowledge. I see some doubtful faces on my screen. Let me give you an example. Ever tried dieting? Dieting? You know it works? On the one hand, there's your diet. You know if you do this, you look the way you want. Guaranteed. It doesn't get clearer than that. On the other hand, there's this chocolate-filled, cream, Now, like, who would get that wrong? I mean, who would get that wrong? On the one hand is your diet, clear, total clarity, the way you want to look on the Frum Beach next summer, your future, it's clear. And a little piece of chocolate cake that's going to take 10 seconds, during which you'll feel like an idiot. And a minute later, you're looking at a plate that is licked clean, like, what happened? Wasn't clear enough? The gap between here and here, or here, wherever it is a long way. There are two efforts that are required. One is gaining clarity, but that's not enough. After you gain the clarities, there's the work of bringing it down in loyalty into action. One does not guarantee the other. You can get it as clear as you like, 99%, whatever figure you want to quote me. And you can be disloyal and betray your own clarity. And it happens all the time. Emunah means loyal. It means being loyal to the knowledge, to act, to walk the walk, and put it into practice. And it's not guaranteed by knowledge at all. My sister will forgive me if I tell a story that I've told many times. When I was an intern in surgery in South Africa, we had a patient in our ward with Berger's disease. Berger's disease, this is a vascular disease. What happens is people who smoke, people who have this disease, have a tremendous sensitivity to the nicotine in the cigarette smoke, and it closes their blood vessels down. First, their fingers fall off, then their hands fall off. Okay, there's not one recorded case in a non-smoker. And if they stop smoking, the disease arrests. They carry on smoking, their fingers and toes fall off. This man was a 45-year-old, highly intelligent engineer, and he came into our ward with a blue leg because the artery supplying his leg. We had to cut off four toes the day that he came into our ward. And this man knew more about the disease than we did. He knew that if he carried on smoking, we'd have to cut his leg off. He smoked heavily for the next 3 weeks, and we were obliged to do an above-knee amputation. The next time I saw him, I was a senior intern in the same hospital, and one day I noticed them wheeling him down the hospital corridor in a wheelchair, still smoking, about to lose an arm. How do people do that? You know, when I mentioned this to a group of doctors in New York, one of them told me that a friend of his is a vascular surgeon. He had a patient like this. When he lost his second arm, he had his friends rig up some wire on the wheelchair so he could carry on smoking. Now, and by the way, this is not a common disease, but every vascular surgeon has seen them. How do you do that? The man stands there with a cigarette and a leg. He says, leg, man, husband, father, walk, leg, or 20 seconds of pleasure during which you'll feel the cold hand of death. How could you get that wrong? The answer is, seeing it clearly does not guarantee that you'll, because there are a lot of blocks on the way down, a lot of blocks. You know what you say to yourself? One more cigarette. One more cigarette, what's that going to do? You say to yourself, one more chocolate. I won't eat it all tomorrow. By the time you finished, it's a big mitzvah. And then you've done it. Do that again. What an idiot. That's the truth. There's a gap between the two. Let me just add this, if I may. I don't want to keep you too long. In Kabbalistic thinking, this is called male, and this is called female. Male is considered the clarity, and female is considered the consistency of bringing it down and making it happen in a difficult world. The Kabbalists always point out that a pregnancy begins with a male contribution, no effort. All the man gives is half a genetic code, that's all. There's no pain, there's no time, there's no staying power, there's no character required. The pregnancy is all the woman. The long walk through pregnancy, with its difficulty and its discomfort and its crisis at the end, that's all female. Walking the walk is female. Starting the process, the initial clarity, this is traditionally why men study Talmud, by the way, is to hone the faculty of clarity. But we're not the ones entrusted with forming character, bringing children into the world, the early years that are formative. Because there are two different efforts here. I know this is a gender-confused generation. Yes, okay. I was ready. Just keep your head clear. There's a male energy and a female. Maleness means point of origin with clarity. Female means the long walk through the night. The Rambam says that life is like standing on a dark plain on a stormy night. You stand there beaten by the rain, lashed by the wind, hopelessly lost, and suddenly there's a flash of lightning. In that instant, you see the road clearer than by day. And as you see it, it disappears in the darkness. And the rest of the night, you walk through the storm on memory alone of a flash of light that you once saw. But you saw it. You know where the road is. Therefore, it begins with clarity. Walk through the night in a direction that you convince yourself, who knows where you'll end up. But when you've seen the clarity, now you're walking through the night. It's dark, indeed. If there is a leap of faith in Judaism, that's the leap. If there is a leap of faith, that's where it is. You know, one of the first tests ever recorded was the first test given to Abraham. Hashem said to Avram, Lech lecha. I want you to go to yourself. Lech lecha. Become who you must become. And what will it look like? You'll see when you get there. Ela aretz asher areka. He tells him exactly how to leave. Leave your father's house, your home, your birthplace. Totally clear. Leap off the cliff, totally clear. When will you arrive on the other side? Where's the other side? You'll see when you get there. My friends, in every ordeal, there's clarity, that you have to do it. 95%, 99% clarity. Without that, things don't move in Judaism. But the leap itself, total darkness. That's called bitachon. You're leaping because you know it's right. You're not making it up yourself. But the test is putting into practice when it's not easy, when you don't see the other side. And why do you not see the other side? Why did God have to tell him, when you get there, you'll see? Because the journey's to yourself. And the journey is to the bigger person that you'll be becoming. You can't see that till you get there. If you were shown what you'll be like when you're more mature, while you're less mature, you'd shrink it to your present dimensions. If you take a 5-year-old child and explain to him what he'll be like when he's 25, he thinks you mean more ice cream, right? Until you've shattered your immaturity and you've broken your limitations. Once you've leaped off the side of the cliff, can you arrive on the other side? And therefore, there'll always be the darkness. I'll say one thing that I think will be very meaningful to Rabbi Hill. Sometimes people say, you religious people, it's so easy. You got your blinkers on, you do the rules, you do what your rabbi says. No courage. You're going in the circumscribed world of the rules, and you just follow the rules. Me, I'm a secularist. I go wherever the truth leads. It's exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. The secularist goes wherever the truth leads in the borders that is predefined. Of course, religion's out of the question. The spiritual world's out of the question. He goes wherever the truth leads in his safely predefined field. The spiritual individual, the spiritual seeker, goes wherever the truth leads. It goes to a country that you won't see till you get there, right? You're talking about sacrificing everything that's dear. Who knows where this will take you? And Rabbi Hill and I see it all the time when people come into the Jewish world. They're coming from a secular world, and they take a heroic step towards Jewish authentic observance, to have any idea what they look like, what will happen to their previous relationships, and all their familiarity, and the humiliation they'll go through. And that's a heroic step. Do they know what it will end up like? They can't have a vision of that. How can they? They haven't been into the depths and the text and the meaning and what mitzvahs are. They're taking a heroic step. Why? Because they see the evidence leads in that direction. Absolutely. Is the logic behind it? Absolutely. Are there great people to admire who've done? Absolutely. What will it look like? You have no idea until you get there. Anyway, let me finish with a story. I think the ladies are going to enjoy this story more than the men, but what can I do? Rashi quotes a story that's brought in the Aruch. You're going back 800 years to when the story was first recorded. The story is called the story of the Bor and the Chulda. Bor and Chulda. Bor means a pit in the ground, and a Chulda is a wildcat or a ferret or some dangerous small animal. I'll abbreviate, but listen to this. There was a young woman who was going to visit her father. She was dressed in her finest, in her Shabbos clothes, with all her jewelry, and she journeyed to see her father. And accidentally, as she was journeying through a desert where there was no one around, she climbed down into a pit, a bore, to drink from the well, and she couldn't get out. It was too high, she couldn't climb out. She would have died there for sure. But it so happened a young man was walking nearby and he heard her cries. He walked over and he put his head in, he looked down into the bore and he saw a woman. He said, "Who are you?" She said her name. She was a Jewish girl. He was a young Jewish man. He said to her, "Are you human?" He thought maybe she was one of the twilight zone spiritual dark forces of the desert. She said, "I'm human." He said, "Make an oath." I want to get this clear. By the way, wouldn't a liar swear that he's telling the truth? In Judaism, when you make an oath, you need to use God's name. The dark side cannot do that. She made an oath. He said, "Fine. If I save you, will you marry me?" She said, "Yes." Didn't have much choice, did she? So he lifted her out of the pit and he wanted to consummate the marriage on the spot. She said, "That's not decent. That's not how we behave. You go back to your town and get ready for the wedding. I'll go back to my town and prepare. Give me enough time to prepare. Then come and meet my parents and then we'll get married." So the young man agreed. So they decided they would make a pact, commitment to marry, what we call a vort, an engagement. But in order to make an engagement in Judaism, you need 2 witnesses. But there was no witnesses, it was a desert. So they decided the 2 witnesses they would take would be the bor that she fell into and a chulda that was running past. In Kabbalistic writing, by the way, it says the bor and the chulda are female and male. There's a lot to talk about here. But anyway, they promised each other faithfully they would marry. They're now engaged. The bor and the chulda, the witnesses, they parted ways. The young lady went back to her town and began preparing for the wedding. The young man went back to his town and forgot. Yeah, we're talking male here. In fact, it's even more embarrassing. It says as soon as she was out of sight, he forgot. He met another woman, eventually got married to her. She became pregnant. She had a child. The child fell into a bore and died. Then the woman had another child. Child was bitten by a chulda. After those two tragedies, the woman turned to her husband and she said, look, this is bizarre. Then he remembered the story. And he told her, she said, Lech legoralcha. If that is the story and that's true, she said, you divorce me, and you go back to the woman that God gave you as your partner. So he divorced her. And he went back to the town that he remembered the girl said she came from all those years before. And he found the town and he found the girl's father. He said, I'll come to see your daughter. I have to marry her. The father said, unfortunately, she's become insane from waiting. People go near them. She shreds their clothing. She just lost her mind. He said, I'll marry her anyway. Father said, well, look, so they walked into the room and the girl started ripping his clothes. He said to her, Bor and Chulda. She recognized him. And then she revealed to him that she'd been pretending to be insane for all those years so that no one else could marry her because she was waiting. They married, they had a happy life together, they had children. What is the story telling you? Male and female. What's male? Let's get it clear. Let's get it totally clear. Who are you? Let's 100% clear. And then instant results. Staying power, loyalty, tenacious attachment to duty, 0. And what's the girl? Logic, objectivity? No, she wanders into a desert and gets lost. Loyalty, 100%. You gave your word, you stay with it. You gave a commitment, you stay with it. Years and years and years later when it's illogical, this is not about logic. This is about character. I made a commitment. I don't break that. That's what's being taught. Rabbi Hill, can I take one more minute? I'll tell you a story. In 1942, the Japanese invaded the Philippines. And there was a battle going on in the Philippines. 1944, the Japanese left. But one Japanese soldier got left behind. This is a famous case, by the way. You look it up, there are good documents about it. He actually wrote a book about it. His name was Lieutenant Hiru Onoda. He was a lieutenant, an officer, highly intelligent, trained in jungle survival. He was left behind in the Filipino jungle, and he carried on fighting the war single-handed. He shot 30 people over the time that he was there, hiding in the jungle, coming out and attacking. Okay. He fought the war single-handed because he'd been left behind. How long did this continue? 30 years. 30 years. 1974, the Japanese government, we're getting complaints. He was still shooting people in 1974. They sent a lieutenant, they sent a Major Suzuki into the jungle to find him. And he found him. Actually, he was actually a Japanese traveler. Anyway, he said to him, Onoda, let's go home. He said, no. He said, why? He said, I'm fighting the war. He said to him, do you know the war's over? He said, of course, I'm not a fool. If you know the war's over, why are you doing this? He said, because I was given a command. I was given a duty by my commanding officer, and I'm doing my duty. He said to him, Onoda, you're being illogical. Onoda said, a soldier's duty is not to be logical. A soldier's duty is to do his duty. If every soldier starts thinking logically, what sort of army do you have? They argued about it. Suzuki went home. Onoda carried on fighting the war. The Japanese high command put their heads together, Japanese government, and they found a solution. They found the elderly officer, I think his name was Tanaka. He was an elderly officer who'd been Onoda's commanding officer during the war. They sent him back into the Filipino jungle with the original Japanese demobilization order. He called him to attention in the jungle. He read out the order to lay down weapons. Onoda handed over his gun and he went back to Japan. The Filipinos called him a hero. They bought him a new blue suit. Very emotional, by the way. He came back to a modern Tokyo to see his parents and his family after 30 years. Read the book about it. It's a fascinating thing. Now I'll ask you a question. What was he doing wrong? He was killing people, right? I mean, on the other hand, he's doing his duty. Talk about emunah. Talk about being loyal to the task. Talk about tenacious attachment to duty that goes on and on and on because you gave a commitment. There's not logic. We're not talking about logic. We're talking about... I told the story to a group of school children in London. And I said to them, high school students, I said to them, what was he doing wrong? Like, he's obviously doing something wrong. One young lady put up her hand. She said he had emunah, but he did not have emet. Right. You need both. It's got to be right and true, and then you got to do it. One without the other is ridiculous. What do you look like if you have truth without loyalty? Then you're the hypocritical philosopher who knows it all and doesn't do it. Like one great philosopher of the last generation, I won't mention any names. He taught his students the highest moral philosophy. One morning they found him crawling out of a house of very ill repute, a very offensive place. They said, Professor, how could you teach us such great morals and behave like that? He said, what's the problem? Does a mathematician have to be a triangle? In Judaism, yeah, you got to be a triangle. You got to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. If you've got great morals and ethics in your mind and you can't, no. And my friends, what does it look like if you have tremendous attachment to duty and no logic? You know these people? You know people are like that? They kill and die at a moment's notice. They go and explode themselves and explode other people, and they with total belief. You know whom I'm talking about? Very dangerous. The people we're talking about have unbelievable emunah. Their belief in their God, they're ready to die at a moment's notice. They're guaranteed a place in heaven. Got no question about it. But scrambled eggs up here. You need both. Their Jewish agenda is emet, clarity. We begin by asking questions and getting the logic clear, but then you've got to bring it down into the organs of emotion and action. One without the other is useless. Male and female. You need that inner marriage of the two faculties. Anyway, this has been a brief introduction to the theme of emunah. We're not talking about blind, mindless faith. We're talking about tenacious attachment to what is logically correct. Yes, there'll be dark times. You may walk through most of the night on the memory only of a flash that you once saw. The Rambam says nobody walks in the light. Some see more flashes, some see less. Emunah is in the dark times. And trust, we call bitachon, when you actually leap the leap. But it goes back to a clarity. And Judaism begins with wisdom, tradition, clarity, rich corroboration, asking questions. You can afford to do that when you're dealing with the truth. But then there's a second work. And the second work is not blindness, but it's a tremendous attachment to the clarity, even when things are no longer clear. And those are the two elements that carry us through.